We would now like to start plenary session number 3, Can COVID-19 Revitalize the SDGs and Enhance the Post-2030 Sustainability Agenda? From PIK, we have Professor Johan Rockstrom. He will be joining us online today. From Tokyo University, Institute of Future Initiative, Professor Naoko Ishii. And the session is to be moderated by Dr. Eric Zussman, Integrated Sustainability Center of IGES. Dr. Zussman?
Can COVID revitalize the SDGs and enhance the post-2030 sustainability agenda? We have two very distinguished speakers with us today. Professor Johan Rockstrom, who is joining us from Stockholm. And Professor Rockstrom is widely credited with helping to conceive of the planetary boundaries concept a little bit more than a decade ago. And he speaks quite eloquently not only on this concept, but also on SDGs and how crisis can lead to big transformative changes. So we're delighted to have him here remotely today. And we also have with us Professor Naoko Ishii, who is joining us from the University of Tokyo, where she is currently director of this newly formed Center for Global Commons. And prior to this, Professor Ishii was also the CEO and chairman of the Global Environmental Facility. I can't think of two better people to discuss the topics that we'll be discussing a little bit later. And to break things off, I'd like to start with a framing presentation. So please allow me to go to the podium. Okay, so as mentioned, the title of our panel today is Can COVID-19 Revitalize the SDGs and Enhance the Post-2030 Sustainability Agenda? And I think it's important to highlight when we think about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in 2015. Unfortunately, if we look at the Asia-Pacific region, on all 17 of these goals that we're supposed to achieve by 2030, progress is slow, and in some cases with climate action, and that's SDG 13 and SDG 14, life below water, there's actually regression. I think this summary statement highlights where we are right now. At the current pace, the world will achieve the SDGs in 2073. That's about 43 years after the current expiration date. Unfortunately, as well, COVID is slowing progress further in most goals and most regions of the world. So this leads us to an important point, though. The famous Nobel laureate Paul Romer has commented that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And his point here is that crises can often break through many of the factors that lock us into unsustainable development patterns. They can break through some of the interests, some of the institutions that keep us moving in the wrong direction. And so COVID, in some ways, while it is slowing progress, also may offer an opportunity. And one of the things that we've done at IGES is look at ways to take advantage of this window of opportunity and to keep it open. And what we've proposed is a decision-making framework that we call the Triple R framework. The framework has 3 different components, what we call the redesign, where we're aiming for an ambitious transformation of our institutions and our infrastructure with a long-term goal of a sustainable future. And we also have the recovery, which is a little bit more focusing on the midterm, where we're trying to integrate not only environmental goals, but also economic goals, as well as social goals. And the strong emphasis here is on allocating funding from stimulus packages to help drive through some of the changes that will lead to the more ambitious transformation. And then the last piece of the pie here is what we call the response. The response focuses on more near-term emergency considerations, especially in the wake of COVID, where health is one of the preeminent concerns. One of the things I want to highlight here is weaving together elements from all three of these, response, recovery, and redesign, we believe is essential for taking advantage of this crisis and bringing through some of the major changes that we need to our social structures and economic structures in order to protect the health of the planet and protect the health of people. And you can see here our most recently published position paper on COVID, where we talk a lot about planetary health and how these different elements, response, recovery, and redesign, fit into a framework that can help lead to a healthy planet and a healthy people. Now, I say this and I raise this framework in a way that is quite recent, but I think it's important to take a look at where we've been to determine how we can get to a more sustainable future. And to do this, I want to turn back to a little bit of my own past. And this is a picture of New York in 1973. I was born actually a year before this, but you can see that New York was suffering through serious depression. Unemployment was over 10%, and the environment was in a sorry state. But what we saw come out of this crisis was also an incredible transformation, not only of New York City itself, but I want to point to a parallel area which I think has some lessons potentially for our sustainability agenda. And this is to open everybody's eyes a little bit. This parallel area is rap music. Okay, now rap music actually originated in 1973 in the streets of New York, from Bronx, New York, from a disc jockey named Kool Herc. And Kool Herc, in many ways, paved the way for a transformation of not only music, but the way that we appreciate culture. And it also might give us some insights into the way that we make sustainability popular enough to transform our social structures. So this type of music, of course, originated from this crisis in New York, but it became popularized in the 1980s, especially as it became integrated and merged with other types of music. So here in 1986, you see the rap music group, Run DMC, working with the hard rock music group, Aerosmith. And they published or performed this song called Walk This Way, which led to this integration, which eventually led us up to 2021, where we really see rap music transforming the way that music is appreciated. And here you see the Korean group BTS sharing one of their songs at the United Nations in New York. And when they shared this song, it was also during the United Nations General Assembly, in a way to also revitalize the SDGs. Okay, now I think there's also some parallels here in Japan too. We've seen some of this transformation happen, for instance, in Kawasaki. And we see this RRR framework that we're using also applying to the case of Kawasaki. I'm not going to go into the details, but just to suggest that we've seen some improvements in air quality in Kawasaki during the response phase. We've seen some allocation of funds that have led to integration between air quality, climate change, and other development concerns during the recovery phase. And we've also seen some efforts at redesign, for instance, redesigning the city hall, setting up a biking infrastructure, or also injecting money into the hydrogen industry. So this type of transformation is actually underway here in Japan, in certain cities, and this RRR framework can help us understand that as well. Now this leads us to, what can we do in terms of thinking about the future? And I think as we look towards the future, it's not only important to consider, how we can accelerate progress on the SDGs that once again will expire in 2030, but to think beyond 2030. We're already seeing this in the climate agenda, as my colleague Tamura-san mentioned. And most recently, we saw at the UN, at the same meeting where BTS performed, the UN Secretary General presented a new report called Our Common Agenda. And in this report, he highlighted 12 different areas that we need to work on, especially the UN needs to work on. And one of those areas was protect our planet. And I think, of course, this is important, but I do have some concerns that the environmental issues that come under protect our planet might be downplayed a little bit too much, and that we need to raise up the platform of some of the environmental issues to make sure that they're given adequate consideration, especially in the post-2030 agenda. I know we're 9 years away, but I think it's a good time to start thinking about this. And one area I would like to see a lot more attention given to is air pollution, especially as it links to climate change. Air pollution is one of the biggest environmental threats to human health, as well as the health of the planet. And it's not only linked to climate change, but it's also linked to many other concerns. I just highlight this picture right here where I saw a very personal and close connection between climate change and air pollution. So you can see the wildfires in California during the summer of 2021. Many of these are attributed to a warmer climate that have dried out the forests in California. And then you can see a picture of my hometown from the news in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Boston is on the east coast of the United States, California is on the west coast, but the air pollution that you see here is coming from California wildfires. So one of the things we would like to promote in IGES, and also personally from my research group, is stronger consideration of air pollution and a one atmosphere approach as we consider a post-2030 development agenda. And we recently published a report on this one atmosphere approach, which would focus on developing a good set of indicators to measure the impacts and causes of air pollution. Also would focusing on governance for a one atmosphere approach, and some visioning and better assessment methods for a one atmosphere approach. So as we look to the post-2030 development agenda, we think air pollution, climate change, and these linkages should be featured more prominently. Okay, I'd like to end there with my framing presentation, and then go on to some discussion questions with our distinguished colleagues. And I'm just gonna go reposition myself back on the seat over here. Okay, so really appreciate everybody's attention that's in the room and outside of the room. And I'd actually, if it's okay with you, Professor Ishii, I'd like to start with you first in terms of questions. 大丈夫ですか? Hi, so desu. Hi. So the first question I have for you is really about how we can accelerate progress on the SDGs. And I want to go to this issue of turning a crisis into an opportunity. So I'm wondering, in your view, how can different stakeholders, businesses, governments, civil society, how can they turn this crisis into an opportunity to accelerate progress on the SDGs?
I actually think this is an excellent question, because we can learn so much from why COVID-19 happened and how, that the lessons we can learn, what lessons we can learn, and how we can use them to redesign the pathway to just not only SDGs, but also the climate change. The fundamental starting point to me is that COVID-19, SDGs, and the climate change actually share the same root cause. And that is, in my view, it's a clash of two systems, one human economic system, and actually natural system. It's represented by kind of planetary boundary or carrying capacity of the Earth system. And because that for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, or particularly since maybe mid-century, mid-last century, our economic system has really put a lot of pressure on the Earth system. And that's why we have this clash of represented by climate change, that the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of the water, the land and the ocean, and actually that the stress of the water, and even the chemical cycle. So fundamentally, unless we actually transform our economic system, we are not able to solve this the challenge. So that the COVID-19 is also the product of this system crash, because that our economic system actually push ourselves so close to the natural system, and that's why that we human have actually got a lot of homogen from wild animals. That's how it started. So what we can learn from that, I think the lesson number one is to really think about how to transform our economic and social system. And then what do I mean by that? Why we actually the economic system becomes so powerful, because we ignored that those global commons, including climate system, but also biodiversity and the other natural system. So one way to really transform the economic system is to recognize the value of those external global commons. So the put a price on carbon is definitely one thing, but also value the natural system, natural capital, and to incorporate it into the economic system is another important way forward. So another important thing is that, as you already mentioned, Eric, that those total system change requires everybody actually working together to achieve the long-term vision. So from that point of view, those multi-stakeholder coalition will be extremely important and to redesign our pathway towards mid-century. So let me stop here, and I will, then you get the mic.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate you highlighting the importance of, redesigning our pathways and recognizing that in many ways the root cause of some of our sustainability challenges and COVID are the same. I think that's a really important point. This is something that Takeuchi Sensei has also mentioned quite frequently. And I like the point that you raised, about, there's some interventions we can take, price on carbon, valuing natural capital, but these have to be done in the context of systemic change and changing our social system to live within and work within the safe operating space of the natural systems is critical for that. That's perfect. That's perfect. So I want to just see if Professor Rockstrom, are you with us right now by any chance? Okay.
Yes, hello, Eric. I'm with you. I hope you can hear me. I'm unfortunately still on mobile connection, but I can see you and hear you very well. I hope you can hear me.
No worries. So this is, I think, one of the key examples of how our societies are being redesigned, if you will, that you can participate with us remotely like this. And so I don't know if you heard the question that I asked Professor Ishii, but basically I'm wondering from your perspective, how do you think we can turn this crisis, the COVID crisis, into an opportunity that accelerates progress on the SDGs? Can you give us some reflections on that question?
Yes, and not surprisingly, I'll be building very much on your introduction, Eric, and your reflections now, because the key entry point in my mind is that we have, I would even argue, unequivocal scientific evidence that the COVID-19 crisis is a manifestation of the Anthropocene. It would, just as Naoko says, and as you also point out, Eric, it would not have happened if it hadn't been for the global, accelerated, integrated social and environmental pressures that we pose unsustainably on the Earth system. And we know that COVID-19 is a zoonosis. It's a virus spillover from wildlife, often via and potentially via domestic animals to humans. We know it's a hockey stick of rise in the number of zoonotic epidemics, but actually every pandemic since the 1960s, when you started showing those photographs, are zoonosis. They are unsustainable exploitation of intact ecosystems causing a larger risk for humanity. So I think one lesson from COVID-19 is to recognize that we have multiple global crises, the climate crisis, the ecosystem crisis, but we now also have a health crisis, and they are all part of the same complex, which means, of course, that when every government, when every financial institution, when every company talks about a resilient recovery from COVID, the key issue is to recognize that that includes I would even argue, should be predominantly focusing on investing in nature. It should invest in the resilience of the biosphere, because that's an insurance for future stability. So that's kind of lesson number one. And lesson number two is of course, from an Earth system scientist, I find it quite significant that we have advanced now to identify 20 tipping elements in the Earth system that regulates the state of the Earth system. Naoko and I call this the new global commons. So the wetlands, the permafrost, the ice sheets, the rainforests, the tropical coral reef systems, and that these are actually fundamental commons because we all depend on them. The stability of them in one corner of the planet determines the state of any society across the world. Well, it's exactly the same thing with COVID when you think about it. Something goes wrong in one corner of the planet, and it hits all of us collectively across the whole world. So governing the commons, the biophysical commons, is like the same thing of avoiding COVID-19 type outbreaks. So I think a lesson of COVID-19 is that it shows how interconnected we are, and it shows that we need to collectively recognize our interdependence, and that, even though it is within national integrities that things are owned and managed, fundamentally we have to have more of a collective approach to navigating the future. So I think those are perhaps two complementary elements to the great inputs that you've given in the start of this conversation. Back to you, Eric.
Yep. Thank you so much, Johan. I really appreciate you highlighting, the importance of zoonosis, but taking that notion of zoonosis and sort of expanding it out and showing that, a lot of our crises are due to this growing integration between, or, interaction between humans and nature. And I also note, the importance of the interconnections, interdependencies. I think back to my graduate school training, and there's book by Joseph Keohane and Robert Nye on complex interdependencies. And I think, that's, maybe I'm dating myself too much. This goes also back to the 1970s, but this notion I think has been around for a while, but I think we're really seeing the manifestations of it these days. And then I really like the points that you're raising about the tipping points and this new set of, or new understanding of the global commons, which I think also links in quite well to Professor Ishii's new position. All right, I'd like to turn over one other quick question, and then I think the session is quite interesting. But the next question is really about lessons from the current SDGs and also COVID for a post-2030 agenda. So we're 9 years away, of course, from thinking about potentially a new set of SDGs, or I don't know exactly what we're going to call them. But I want to hear if you have any insights into what would be some of the potential implications from this past year and the SDGs themselves for a post-2030 agenda. And Professor Ishii, I'd like to turn it over to you first.
Thank you. I just also want to build on what just Johan said. I mean, our world really doesn't have an effective governing mechanism of the global commons. And it becomes so clear that from our approach, our response to COVID-19, I'm actually the part of this high-level independent panel of financing global commons of COVID. Then the one, and as Johan said, the COVID is also global commons until everybody is safe, nobody is safe. And the world has difficulties to understand this concept. And the finance ministers still do hesitate to put some small amount of money to invest in prevention of doing that. So that how the world can come up with a governing mechanism of global commons, understanding that small amount of investment really has a huge payoff to the entire globe. So that is one lesson I learned from this COVID-19, and this has a significant implication going forward, that yes, the global commons should be really shared by everybody as a responsibility, and until that that period comes, we can't really keep our life support system safe. So that so this is a lesson of how to create a better governing mechanism that based on science and based on the calculation and then built on, so then that we should come up with a much more scientific pathway going forward. So that is my reflection from COVID-19.
That's great. So this governing mechanism, I think, is essential, and I really like this point, and it relates, to perhaps means of implementation under a future set of SDGs. Johan, we don't have too much time, another 2 or 3 minutes or so, but I'd like to turn the same question over to you. What do you think might be the implications of COVID and the current status of the SDGs for a post-2030 agenda?
Yeah, thanks. And well, number one, which of course we so far do not see any success on, is I think it's quite remarkable that 200 countries in the world have been so far putting up $17 trillion in COVID recovery investments. I think this just shows that we are able to kind of gather ourselves collectively, globally, in the face of a global crisis. We leave Glasgow still fighting over 100 billion, which is like 0.1 trillion, which is a fraction of the 17 trillion that was put on the table, has been put on the table for COVID recovery. I think we have to recognize that this delivering on the SDGs and delivering on a sustainable, prosperous, equitable future within the SDG framework requires big shifts in investment flows. And everything from internalizing externalities, but also supporting a soft landing, an equitable landing for everyone in this hump that we're in right now. The hump is really, how do we feed humanity without expanding agriculture into intact ecosystems? How do we transition into a zero carbon energy future? There is an investment hump here. Just look at how India behaved in the last sections of Glasgow, putting a spanner in the wheel, really showing that it's too costly to go too fast on the transition towards the SDGs on the energy side, unless you also have some bumpers, some absorbers or some buffering. So I think the social buffering will be fundamental to be able to kind of transition sustainably within planetary boundaries, while at the same time cushioning so that societies around the world remain, so say, harmonious along that path.
Excellent. So I really appreciate the insights into this sort of social buffering and also demonstrating that governments can have the political will to allocate significant sums of resources, when pushed. And I think this could, potentially have important implications, especially as we navigate this sort of more just transition towards a sustainable world. I'd like to once again express my appreciation to Professor Ishii and for Professor Rockstrom for joining us. It's been an honor and privilege to be able to moderate this session. Thank you so much. You can clap.
Thank you.
ご登壇者の皆様、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. This concludes the session 3 of the plenary session.